Chapter 1. Massachusetts, 1891. When she was only 16, Marilyn Mary Brown already knew who she'd marry. She knew the name of the boy she would love for the rest of her life, and she knew she would spend it right there in Barley, Massachusetts. When she had first started school at the one-room schoolhouse there in Barley, she'd noticed a boy who was 2 years older than her by the name of William Jones. At first, she'd hated him. She remembered running home from her first day of school, begging her mother not to make her go back. "Please, Mama. There's a horrid boy there. His name is William, and he chases me at recess, trying to put toads in the back of my dress." Mama had been firm, as she always was. "No matter how many toads he puts in the back of your dress, you need to go to school. You want to be able to read the Bible and read recipes so you can cook for your family, don't you? And then you can read special books to your children." Mary didn't exactly come from a wealthy family, but her father ran the only mercantile in town, and she always had what she needed. Her parents were careful not to spoil her, but as an only child, they had high hopes for her. "Then can you ask Papa to tell him to leave me alone? Please?" Mama shook her head. "You're going to have to learn to deal with people who don't treat you as they should, Mary. It's part of growing up." Mary sighed. "I don't want to have to talk to him. If you ask him to stop, maybe he will. It's always worth trying." Mama was ill. Mary didn't know it at the time, but that's why she spent all her time sitting in the rocking chair beside the window, watching what would happen outside. Mary climbed onto her mama's lap and rested her head against her shoulder. "I wish we could go for a walk and pick flowers like we used to." Mama smiled, stroking a tendril of hair that had escaped from Mary's braid. "I wish we could too. Maybe someday. Right now, I'm too tired to make that kind of walk." Mary nodded solemnly. "Then I will go and pick flowers for you and bring them back so you can see them." Mama smiled. "That's a good idea. Make sure not to pick too many though. We want everyone else to be able to admire their beauty as well." Mary rushed out to pick flowers for her mama, being extra careful to get a full array of colors, but to leave a great deal more than she picked. Her mama would have pretty flowers, but the rest of the flowers would still be there to color the world and make it special for anyone who walked along her path. As she finished, she started to run toward home, but stopped short. There he was, William. The boy who had been mean to her at school. She took a deep breath and marched straight up to him, stopping inches from his face and cranking her head back to look up and see him. "I want you to stop chasing me at recess. And keep those ugly old toads to yourself. I thought all girls liked to kiss toads, to see if they turned into princes." She wrinkled her nose at him. Her mama had read her the story of the princess kissing the frog, and she knew better. Girls kiss frogs, not toads. So keep the toads and you kiss them. "Maybe I'll kiss you instead," William said, grabbing her arms. Mary kicked William as hard as she could and turned and ran for home, her bouquet of flowers for her mama clutched close to her chest. She was panting when she shut the door behind her, so she waited a moment, not wanting to worry her mama. She'd learned in the past few months that mama had to be handled carefully, and with much love. After catching her breath, she hurried into the room where her mama was and handed her the flowers, smiling widely. "I picked just enough to make a pretty bouquet for the supper table, but not so many you can tell they're gone from the side of the road." Mama took the flowers and brought them to her nose. "They're perfect, Mary. Put them on the table now, and then come back to me." Mary did as she was told, going into the kitchen where their helper was making supper. "Mrs. Johnson, will you get me a vase, please? I picked some pretty flowers for Mama." Mrs. Johnson smiled and reached up to a high shelf to get down a vase, filling it with water. "There you go. Your mama is lucky to have a girl who loves her as much as you do." Mary shook her head solemnly. "No, I'm the lucky one to have her as a mama. I'm the only person in the world who can call her mama. Go put that on the table now. Yes'm. Mary hurried to put the vase on the table and went back to her mama in the parlor, still in her rocking chair, beside the window. Papa carried her there each morning, and she was still there when Mary got home from school in the evenings. She hurried to Mama's side. Do you want me to bring you a glass of water? Mama shook her head. No, thank you. Why don't you come up here, and we can talk for a moment, before Papa comes home? Mary quickly climbed onto her mama's lap. What do you want to talk about, Mama? You know that I've been moving slower lately, and Papa's been carrying me around instead of me walking. Yes, but you're going to get stronger and better, and when it's spring again, you'll be able to pick flowers with me again. Papa told me. Mama shook her head. Papa's trying to make you think I'll get better so you won't be too sad. She took a deep breath. I saw the doctor today, and he said I don't have much more time to be with you. We'll never be able to pick flowers together again, but we can still spend time together. I want to read you my favorite book before it happens. Before what happens, Mama? Are you going somewhere? Mama closed her eyes in a way that Mary would later understand meant she was in a great deal of pain. I'm going to heaven to be with God. I'm dying, baby. Mary blinked a few times before shaking her head. You can't die. You're not done helping me to be a grown woman yet. You have to stick around for a lot longer. Mama smiled, stroking Mary's cheek. I wish I could, sweetheart. I'm very sick though. So we're going to read a book. A favorite of mine. She picked up a book from the table beside her bed and opened it to the first chapter. Heidi, Chapter 1. Mary rested her head on Mama's shoulder as she listened to her read the story of a young girl living with her grandfather. That's how Papa found them less than an hour later, both of his beautiful ladies engrossed in a book about an orphan girl. How are my girls today? Mama smiled. We're good. We're reading my favorite story. Papa smiled as he looked down at them, so alike in their looks. Both had blonde hair and bright blue eyes, and the same delicate features. Let's go into supper. Mrs. Johnson is putting it on the table now. Mary hurriedly slid off her mother's lap. We'll read some more tomorrow. Promise? I promise. Now hurry to the table before your food gets cold. Mary ran to the table, always obedient. She couldn't let her parents down. At supper, she talked about her first day of school and the boy with the toads. It was a day Mary would never forget, her first day of school, the day she found out her mother was dying, and the day she first heard her favorite book. And the day she met the man she'd marry. William Jones. 16-year-old Mary looked out the window to see if her father was coming. She was supposed to be setting the table, but she was so nervous. William would be by to ask her father for permission to marry her that very night. They wanted to be married right away, and spend the rest of their lives raising vegetables and babies. William would be a farmer like his father, and his father before him. She couldn't help but remember how they'd realized they were meant to be together. She'd been 14, and one of the boys in school had been teasing her. Many of the boys teased her in a nice way, but not Bob. Bob teased her in a mean way, and he always had. Bob had cornered her against the schoolhouse and the tree that was right beside it. Let me go. Mary kicked at him, but he moved his legs away, so he wouldn't be hurt. The next thing she knew, William had spun the boy around by his shoulder and punched him right in the face. Mary swiped away a tear that came too late. Who cried after they were rescued? It was just strange. After Bob ran away, she stood facing her nemesis, the boy who had bothered her since her first day of school. Thank you, she said awkwardly. William put a hand on her shoulder. Don't cry. It hurts my heart when you do that. Mary sniffled. It does? He nodded. I've only seen you cry 3 times, and I'll never forget any of them. Mary pulled her handkerchief from her sleeve and wiped away her tears. When have you seen me cry? She couldn't recall ever crying in front of him. When teacher came to tell you that your mama died, not long after you started school, again at her funeral, and just now. I don't like it when you cry. Mary nodded, closed her eyes, and drew on the strength she knew her mama would want her to show. Thank you again for your help, William. She'd walked back into the classroom, and there on her desk was another bouquet of flowers. She knew that Albert was leaving the flowers for her. Everyone knew it. She was considering letting him court her as soon as she turned 15. That's when her papa said she would be old enough to court. She didn't like him much, but she didn't want to be an old maid either. She took the flowers and smiled at Albert, nodding to thank him. Albert had grinned at her, as if to say he knew she was his. Albert did kind things, and that made him worth considering as a potential beau. Just as teacher walked to the front of the class, Mary saw William stand up. The flowers aren't from Albert. They never have been. They're from me. She blinked at William, and suddenly it all made sense. He was the one leaving all the gifts for her. Were the apples from you? He nodded. And the peppermint sticks in your desk as well. Would you be so kind as to walk me home from school today? She'd asked softly, trying not to draw too much attention. Everyone heard, of course, and there were snickers, but from that day forward, their names were linked as if it was impossible to say one without the other. As they walked home from school, he'd talked to her about that awful first day, where she'd been so angry. I didn't know how to tell you that you were the prettiest girl I'd ever seen, so I was stupid, and I chased you around with that toad. I wanted you to notice me. Oh, I noticed you all right. I thought you were mean and cruel. I went home and told my mama how mean you were. He sighed. I'm very sorry for upsetting you. He reached out and took her hand in his. I want you to be my girl. She smiled at him shyly. I think I'm already your girl. You are? Really? Yes, but don't tell anyone. My papa says I'm not allowed to court until I'm 15, and that's 6 whole months away. Then I won't kiss you until then, he said, winking at her and making her blush again. You can't kiss me. Not until we're engaged. It wouldn't be right. Are you asking me to marry you, Mary? 'Cause I'll say yes, and then you're stuck forever. She giggled. Maybe we should start courting in 6 months, and you can ask me to marry you when I'm 16. Mama got married at 16, so I'm sure Papa thinks that's just the right age. When they got to her door, he leaned down and kissed her cheek. That doesn't count, 'cause it's not on your lips. I sure do want a real kiss though. She shook her head. No. Not until we're engaged. But, I want a real kiss too. As she said the last words, she'd hurried into the house and shut the door. When she'd peeked out the window a minute later, he was still standing there with a goofy grin on his face. How could she not have known that he had feelings for her? Mary heard the door open, and pulled herself back to the present. Hi, Papa. How was your day? She hurried to him and took his coat and hat as her mama had when she was small, before returning to finish setting the table. It was good. He studied her for a moment. What did you learn in school today? We had to write essays today, and I wrote about how much I want to be like my mama. She'd written about how she had made her mama promise every day that she would read the next chapter of Heidi, so she'd live longer. In the end, there had been 2 chapters left when her mama had died. For a long time, she'd been angry that mama had broken her promise and not finished it, but she'd learned that it was she who was wrong, asking mama to make the promise. Papa's face softened. You are like your mama. Just like her. Mary finished setting the table and walked over to hug Papa. Thank you. I can't think of a better compliment you could give me. Papa's arms closed around her, holding her tight. I can't either. Mary sniffled a bit. She and her papa had made it through a lot of years without her mama, thanks to Mrs. Johnson. All the things that were too indelicate for a father to discuss with his daughter, she'd helped with. All the things that a mother taught a daughter, she'd helped with. She was more the age of a grandmother, but she'd become what Mary had needed in her mother's absence. And now Mary was ready to marry and start her life as a wife. Ready to have a family of her own. She couldn't wait. Chapter 2. Mary was clearing the table when a knock came to the door, and she jumped, casting a side glance at her papa. You finish. I'll see who's here. She nodded, keeping her head down as he opened the door. Well, if it isn't William Jones. What can I do for you? Mary is busy with the supper dishes. Papa's voice was as cold as it always was when William came by. He wasn't as fond of her beau as she was. I want to have a word with you, Mr. Brown. Papa stood still and stared at the boy before finally nodding. Come in. We'll go to the parlor. Mary dawdled as she cleared the dishes from the table, standing as close to the parlor as she could. Papa noticed her and closed the door, and she sighed, walking into the kitchen to wash the dishes. She and Mrs. Johnson fixed supper together every evening, but she did the dishes alone. Her mind was running wild as she thought about what William and Papa could be saying to each other. Surely Papa would understand that it was time for her to marry. She was 16. Several girls in her class had married already. Soon she'd be an old maid. Why, 2 of her former classmates already had babies. She smiled and did a quick spin in the kitchen, humming a happy tune under her breath. While it was scary to wait for the talk to be over, she knew how it would end, how it had to end. She'd read enough fairy tales to know that they all ended with a wedding, and the words, and they all lived happily ever after. It was time for her happily ever after. Of course, her mama hadn't lived happily ever after, but she knew very well mama had been happy throughout her life. She'd died young, which had broken her papa's heart, but mama had been happy until the end of her life. Their last days together, reading through Heidi, had been so special to her. Surely her life with William would be just as good. She was finished with the dishes, and had found a book and planted herself at the dining room table, before the door to the parlor finally opened again more than an hour later. Papa looked between her and William, before he nodded. I'll give you 10 minutes of privacy. He turned and headed up the stairs, leaving her alone with William. Never before had her father left them alone, so she was both surprised and pleased. Surely this meant he'd agreed to the marriage. As soon as her father had climbed the stairs, Mary jumped to her feet. What did he say? She rushed forward, taking William's hands in hers. It was so hard to wait out here while you talked. I wanted to be in there with you, giving all the reasons we should marry immediately. William sighed. He said I may marry you, but there are conditions that must be met first. His brown eyes met hers, his filled with a sadness she'd never seen there. His eyes were always merry, and now they made her want to weep. Conditions? What kind of conditions? Her papa knew they'd been courting for more than a year, and she'd been certain he would agree immediately. She was shocked that he was being difficult. William took her hand in his. Let's sit and talk about it. Of course. She didn't want to sit. She wanted him to tell her that they could plan their wedding. It didn't have to be a big one. She'd wear her mama's wedding dress, and they could get married at the small church in town where they'd both attended their whole lives. William would finish school the next week, but he promised to still walk into town to walk her home every evening. He had a job as a farmhand for old Mr. Hardy, and he worked for him on the weekends and after school. Your father wants me to go west and get some land. If I prove up on it, then we can marry. He'd never thought he'd consider being a homesteader. Eventually, he'd inherit his father's land, and he could be a farmer right there in Massachusetts, but it's what her father wanted. He'd do anything to marry her. But it takes 5 years to prove up on land. And there isn't any left that's close. She shook her head adamantly. Let's elope. We can go to Beckham and marry right away. No one can stop us. I'm 16. A full-grown woman. Just like my mama was. Why wasn't he fighting what her father said? He acted like it was the most normal thing in the world to be told he had to go west. William rubbed the back of his neck. I know. I don't want to go against him, though. He's the only family you have. I'll go, and I'll make a good life for us. He couldn't be the reason she and her father parted ways. He'd never really seen eye to eye with her father, but she loved him, and that was good enough for him. Mary felt the tears escape the corners of her eyes. I don't want you to go. She clung to one of his hands with both of hers. Please stay. He used his thumb to rub away one of her tears. This is the 4th time I've seen you cry, and the only time I've caused it. I'm so sorry. She took a deep breath, fortifying herself. Well, if you must go, then you must. It's a good time of year for it. Promise me you'll write. It would be better if you went in the spring, when all life was starting over. She'd wait for him, as long as it took. Every single week. No matter how busy I get, I'll write to you. She stood, wrapping her arms around his waist and hugging him close. I'll walk you out. He raised an eyebrow. Never before had she walked him out, even with all the times he'd visited over the years. He turned to her as soon as they were outside. Did you have something else you wanted to say? He asked, keeping his voice low. She shook her head. No, but I have something else I want to do. She reached up and pulled his head down to hers, pressing her lips to his. She'd never allowed him to kiss her, always believing they should wait until they were engaged. William held her close, his hand stroking down her back, feeling her corset through her dress there. I'm going to miss you so much. He wanted so badly to take her with him. Together, they could conquer the world. They could do anything. She sniffled again. Will you come see me before you go? He shook his head. It'll only be harder if I do. I'll go first thing in the morning, and I'll write you as soon as I arrive. I love you, Mary Brown. She bit her lip, nodding. I love you too, William Jones. She leaned against the wall of her house as she watched him go, already missing him. Her heart would go with him, and stay with him through the years they had to be apart. She wanted to go into the house and yell at her father for making him go, but it wouldn't make anything easier. When he had completely disappeared from her sight, Mary opened the door and went back inside, slipping up the stairs. She didn't want to talk to her father. She understood why he'd insisted that William go away, but that didn't make it any easier. The man she loved would be gone from her, only reachable by letter. She threw herself on her bed and wept in a way she hadn't since her mother had died. She would miss him every single day. 2 weeks later, Mary was beginning to worry. She hadn't yet received a letter from William, but surely that was because he had yet to reach his destination. She'd thought she would hear from him at one of the train stops, but apparently that wasn't going to happen. She hounded the postmistress daily, asking if she'd received any letters, and the poor woman had always shaken her head with a look of sadness in her eyes. Everyone knew why she was sad. She got pitying looks wherever she went. Even though they knew he was gone to make his fortune, they still assumed he'd never come home, but she had faith. She knew William would never give up on her. They belonged together. When he'd been gone 4 weeks, she received her first letter from him. It was short, and not full of news, which disappointed her. It simply told her that he'd gotten a homestead in South Dakota, and he would send a longer, newsier letter as soon as he had the crops planted. She carried the letter in her pocket and reread it every day until the day his mother came to her house. Mrs. Jones and her father spent an hour closeted away, talking about something, and then Mrs. Jones left. Her father called her into the parlor to speak with her. "What's going on, Papa? Why was Mrs. Jones here?" He frowned at her, shaking his head. "She just got word that William was killed. His own horse trampled him." Mary shook her head. "That can't be true. How could he be dead and her heart still be beating?" "I'm going out there." "He can't be dead, Papa." "He is. You need to calm down. You can't travel that far by yourself. You were raised to be a proper young lady." She felt numb. The tears wouldn't fall. "This is your fault, you know." Her words were soft, but full of anger. "You sent him away without giving us a chance to marry. Why would you do that?" He frowned, shaking his head at her. "I did it because it was the best thing for you. Maybe you can't see it, but I'm older and wiser. I know you aren't ready to marry. You married Mama when she was 16. And it killed her." Mary shook her head. "This has nothing to do with Mama's death. Why did you do this to me?" She hurried from the room and ran upstairs, slamming her bedroom door. Picking up the one object that always brought her comfort, she settled down to read Heidi for the umpteenth time. The book would soothe her soul and make her better. Something had to. Long after her father went to bed, she sat up reading. She couldn't stay there. She couldn't continue to live with the man who had killed her William. She carefully packed only the essentials into a carpet bag she found, and she walked down the stairs. No, she'd find a way to live on her own. She did what she wished she could have talked William into doing 6 weeks before. She left, and she didn't look back. Asterisk. Mary got off the train in Beckham, only a 45-minute train ride from her home. She looked around the station, watching people say goodbye and hug one another in greeting. How could they all act as if the world was still the same place it had been a month before? William was dead. Didn't they know the world would never be good again? A gentle hand on her arm made her jump. "Are you all right?" The woman asking had blonde hair and green eyes filled with concern. "Where are you going?" Mary shrugged. "I don't know. My name is Elizabeth Miller." "Are you looking for work?" "I suppose I am." Mary hadn't really thought about how she'd earn a living. "My cook just married and has left me without help." "Do you cook?" Mary nodded. "I do. I enjoy cooking." Miss Miller took her arm. "Come home with me. I have a nice room you can stay in, and you can be my new cook. All right?" Her voice was gentle, as if she was talking to a child. Mary followed along, shielding her eyes as they walked into the sunrise, not knowing what else to do. She needed someone to take care of her. There was no doubt about that. An hour later, she was settled in a cozy room that connected to the kitchen in the biggest house she'd ever seen. She unpacked her things without really looking around her. She didn't care where she was or what she did. Her life was over. Why didn't God just smite her now? There was no point in going on. Asterisk. After her first week of cooking for Miss Miller, the older woman sat her down to talk to her. "I have your first week's wages here. I wondered how you're liking your new position?" Mary shrugged. "It's fine. I like to cook." Truly, she didn't care what she did. Her whole life was just a time of waiting to die. Without William, what is there to live for? "So you said." Elizabeth frowned at her. "Did something happen to you? Are you all right?" Mary shook her head. "I don't think I'll ever be all right again. The only man I've ever loved died while he was building a life for me." Elizabeth had seen grief before, but this girl's grief was all-encompassing. She needed something to keep her going, and she needed it quickly. I run a business here. Did you realize that? Mary shook her head. She'd paid little attention to the comings and goings around her. She didn't care about anything but doing her job and mourning her William. Elizabeth tried again. How would you like to add to your duties? I'd love it if you'd help me with my correspondence from time to time. I run a mail-order bride agency, you see. And I have a newspaper that goes out monthly that I'm always needing help with. Are you any good with spelling? Mary shrugged. I'm passable. How would you feel about helping me then? I'd love to have a companion to help me as well as a cook. I suppose I can do that. Not that she cared. How could she? William was gone. Forever. Nothing mattered at all. I'm so glad. I've been needing someone. Truthfully, she needed no help. She had Bernard, and he could do everything she needed. Mary was lost though, and Elizabeth had the ability to help her find herself again. At least she hoped she could. She found a stack of letters and gave them to Mary. I'd appreciate it if you'd read through these and find the ones that are unmarriageable. Ones you think might have something wrong with them. Mary looked down at the letters as if she had no idea where they came from. All right. I can do that. Elizabeth smiled. I'm glad. Thank you, Miss Miller. Please, call me Elizabeth. We're going to be working together, after all. Mary nodded. Together. She repeated the word as if in a trance, then looked down at the top letter in her hands. What did it matter what she did? William was dead. Chapter 3. Beckham, Massachusetts, 1896. Mary hummed softly to the baby in her arms. Little Benjamin was the 3-month-old son of Bernard and Elizabeth Tandy, formerly Elizabeth Miller. Mary was his primary caretaker, having left behind the job of cook. She felt a yearning deep inside her to have a child of her own. Could she ever make do with a man who wasn't her William, though? Would any other man ever be good enough? She paced back and forth as the baby fell asleep in her arms, and she gently laid him in the cradle that had been handmade by his grandfather for him. As soon as she set him down, she wandered back into Elizabeth's office, rolling up her sleeves. Let's get through as much as we can before Benjamin wakes up again. He's such a sweet baby. Elizabeth eyed her employee, seeing something she'd never seen in her eyes before. It took her a minute to recognize it for what it was. Resolve. She had resolved the past and was ready to move on with her future. Without saying a word, Elizabeth handed half of her stack of letters to Mary. As she read through her half, she considered each man for her former cook and friend. Mary deserved love more than anyone she knew, and she was finally ready for it. Asterisk. 2 weeks later, Elizabeth was nursing Benjamin as she flipped through the letters that had come in. She picked up one of them and read it over again. And then again. There was nothing special in the letter. It was from a farmer in South Dakota who needed a bride. So many letters said the same thing. But Elizabeth felt this was the one. She glanced across the room at Mary, who was diligently proofreading the copy of the Groom's Gazette that would be going out the following week. Mary, I found a letter I think you should consider. Mary frowned. Do you think that there's time to squeeze one more letter into the Gazette this week? I suppose we could go with a smaller type. Elizabeth leaned forward earnestly, saying a silent prayer that Mary would listen to her. Not for the Gazette, for you. Wait, what? Me? A mail-order bride? You know I'll never love again. Elizabeth smiled softly, her eyes knowing. I know you say that, but you already love again. You love little Benjamin with everything inside you. You need a child of your own, Mary. You can't continue to live here. This isn't where you're meant to be. Mary frowned, leaning back in her chair, stunned at the idea. She did want children, but I'm not sure I can marry, though. Would it be right to marry a man and not give him my heart? I worry about that too. This letter is your answer. Elizabeth held it out, and after a long pause, Mary stood and walked across the room, taking it from her friend. I'll read it, but I'm not making any promises. Mary looked down at the letter, frowning. How can Elizabeth think I can marry someone other than my William? My dear prospective bride. It is with great sorrow that I am penning this letter. I am a farmer in South Dakota, and I have worked hard for years to get to a point in life where I can support a wife and children. I am ready for a family, but I'm not ready to love. I may never love again. If you are between the ages of 18 and 22, are able to cook and keep house, and desire to have children, then I am looking for you, but please be aware that no love will ever be shared with you. I am incapable of loving. I am 23 years old, of passable looks, and am willing to work hard alongside a wife. If you are interested, please reply. B. Jones. I see why you thought this one would work, Mary said softly, reading the letter over again. I know I'll never love again, either, so it seems as though we're meant for one another, doesn't it? She sighed. I'll respond, but don't get your hopes up. She picked up a pen, inkpot, and paper from Elizabeth's desk and sat down to get to work. She thought about her words carefully before writing them down. She had to make it clear she wanted children, but not love. He needed to be as knowledgeable about what to expect as he'd been clear with her. Dear Mr. Jones, I believe I would be suited for your wife. I'm 21 years old, and I will never love again. I have worked as a cook for a living for a good portion of the past 5 years, and I currently work as a nanny and secretary. I am an excellent cook and a good housekeeper. I work hard and would be willing to work beside you. I know deep in my heart that I want to have children, but I'm not willing to even consider falling in love. That's why I believe we would suit one another well. If you are willing to consider me, I'm willing to travel to South Dakota as your mail-order bride. Thank you for your time. Marilyn Brown. Elizabeth read over the letter and nodded. I think that's perfect. You're forthright, and he won't expect more than you can give him. Would you be willing to post it today? Of course. Some days Mary walked to the post office, and others it was Elizabeth. Lately, it was always Mary, unless Bernard was accompanying her employer. Her life had been in danger for quite some time, due to some work she had done to help women escape from slavery. Mary stared down at the letter in her hand, a sad look on her face. By writing the letter to an unknown man agreeing to marry him, she was shutting the final door on the life she'd thought she'd lead. A lone tear trickled down her cheek. The first she'd ever been able to cry for her William. When the return letter arrived less than a month later, how quickly mail was carried in these modern times, Mary turned it over and over in her hands. She didn't know if she wanted him to want her to come or not. Finally, she slit the letter open and read the contents. Elizabeth sat at her desk, watching Mary's face closely. The baby was sleeping contentedly in his cradle off to one side of the room. Dear Marilyn, you sound like the bride I am looking for. I've enclosed a check for Mrs. Tandy's services, and some spending money for your trip. Your train will leave on Wednesday, May 13, sup at 10 in the morning. I will be at the station when you arrive. I'm tall, have dark hair, and a full beard. Yours, Bill. Mary read the letter once more, before walking over and placing the check on Elizabeth's desk. My ticket is for tomorrow's train at 10 in the morning. Well, that doesn't give us much time, does it? Mary shrugged. I've made myself a couple of new dresses in the evenings, knowing this could come at any moment. I know the mail-order bride business almost as well as you do at this point. Elizabeth looked at her friend, someone who had been a huge part of her life for the past 5 years, and felt a tear trickle down her cheek. I'm going to miss you. I'll miss you too. So much. Are you going to tell your father where you're going? Mary had long since confided her full story to Elizabeth, and at her friend's urging, had mended fences with him. She hadn't been willing to move back to his home, though. No, she would continue to live independently of him. Since she'd left, he'd remarried, which she felt was good for him. He'd been a good father to her, and she'd visited him a couple of times. It had always seemed terribly formal to her, though. William's death would always be a wall between them. I think I will. I'll write him a letter. He's busy with his new family. Mary had more contact with Mrs. Johnson than she did with her father. She exchanged letters with the housekeeper at least once a month, so she'd be certain to write her as well. Elizabeth frowned. I think it would be good for you to go see him. Mary shrugged. There's no time. I have to get my room packed up. Do you have any idea how much has accumulated in that small room in 5 years? I'm going to accompany you to the train station. Who's going to watch Benjamin? We'll push him in his buggy. It won't hurt anything, and Bernard will walk with us. I refused to say goodbye to my best friend until the very last moment. Mary rushed across the room and hugged Elizabeth tightly. I can love again, you know. It's not the same, of course, but you've shown me there are different kinds of love. And I love you very much, lizard breath. Elizabeth laughed as she brushed away the tears. Mary often teased her about the name her siblings, known as the Demon Horde, had given her years before. I love you too, Mary. You'll write me, won't you? You know I will. As soon as I arrive in this Butterfly Meadows place, and then at least monthly. I doubt there will be news to share weekly. You never know. Elizabeth sighed. I'm happy you're going to get married and start a family. You need to be a mother. Mary smiled. I do. I didn't realize just how much I wanted children of my own until I spent some time with Benjamin. Now it's all I can think about. Then it's time. Elizabeth picked up the baby and walked through the house. Let's go. Where? Mary asked, confused. We're going to go pack up your room. But why? It'll only take me an hour or two. Because I'm spending as much time with my friend as I can before she gets on a train to South Dakota tomorrow. You realize we'll never see each other again. Mary shrugged. I don't know about that. I think people will find a way to fly like birds soon, don't you? Elizabeth shuddered. As long as you don't ask me to fly, we're good. Asterisk. Elizabeth and Mary set out for the train station at just past 8 the following morning. The walk would only take 15 minutes, but they declared it was too fine a day to sit around at home, watching the clock tick. Mary knew she'd be getting little chance to walk for the next 9 days, and she wanted to stretch her legs before it was time to sit cramped on the train. Bernard walked behind them, his eyes constantly moving as he watched for any danger that could possibly befall his wife and infant son. Mary was important to him as well, but no one was more important than his family. As they walked, Elizabeth reminded Mary she would always have a home with her if anything happened. Mary smiled. I've heard your speech. You say the same thing to all of the mail-order brides who you match up. But I mean it even more with you. You have to promise me you won't stay in a bad situation. You know I'd never do that. I've seen real love. While I don't think I'll find it again, I know that I won't allow anyone to mistreat me. You can stop worrying about that. How can I not worry about you? You're getting on a train to marry a stranger. I know how frightening it is to pledge your life to a man you know and love. I can't imagine how it would be with a stranger. Elizabeth stopped walking in the middle of the sidewalk. I've changed my mind. I don't want you to go. Stay here and help me raise my children. Mary laughed softly. You've taught me to live again, Elizabeth. You don't really want me to stay here and not move forward. Elizabeth sighed. I guess I don't, but I'll worry about you every day until I hear from you. Don't you dare forget to write me. You know I won't. I never would have guessed it, but I'm a very good correspondent. I actually enjoy writing letters. She had a boxful she'd written to William over the years. She knew it was time to destroy them, but how could she? He was the only man she'd ever love, and she wasn't giving up the letters she'd written to him. She would find a good place to hide them from her new husband, and he'd never be wiser. Are you going to tell Bill about your William? Mary shrugged. I'm not certain. I've thought about it a lot, but it sounds like it was a case of puppy love, not true love when I discuss it. How can I make someone understand just how much he meant to me? Elizabeth frowned. You made me understand. Surely your future husband will be caring enough that you can share your innermost thoughts. I have a feeling we'll be more work partners than lovers. I don't think there will be a lot of confidences between us, and that's just fine with me. I don't want him to take William's place, and I'd feel like he was if I let him in that much. Just don't close your heart away from him. Promise? Mary sighed. I don't know if that's a promise I can keep right now. I'll have to think about it after I've met him. Most likely, I'll spend the rest of my life in a loveless marriage, which will be all right, because I'll have children to shower my love on. Elizabeth shook her head. I can't imagine living like that. I hope you change your mind for your own sake. The conductor called Mary's train, and she looked at her friend, fat tears forming at the corners of her eyes. I'll miss you and think of you every day. I promise to write as soon as I get there. I'll write as well. Kiss Benjamin goodnight for me every night. Bernard rolled his eyes as the two women embraced. You're going to miss your train, Mary. Mary stopped on the first step of the train to wave goodbye. Once she was in her seat, she refused to look back. She could start again. She'd already done it once. Why would this time be any different? Chapter 4. Mary was exhausted by the time her train arrived in South Dakota. She had briefly considered using some of her savings to purchase a sleeping car, but had decided against it. Now she wished she'd done it. Her whole body ached from all the sitting she'd done, and she wanted nothing more than a long hot bath. She felt like she hadn't bathed in months. She grabbed her carpet bag that she'd kept in the train with her, and then she carefully walked up the aisle to exit the train. If she never had to ride on a train again, it would be much too soon. She stepped out onto the small platform in front of the train and looked around, trying to spot a man with dark hair and a beard. She didn't see anyone who matched the description, so she wandered around, slowly stretching her legs. She stood around waiting for more than 10 minutes before a wagon pulled up beside the platform, and a man jumped down. He wore brown pants, a dirty white shirt, and suspenders. You Marilyn? Mary nodded. His voice sounded like something from her past, and her eyes immediately met the stranger's. She nodded, feeling like someone else was controlling her neck muscles. Bill? Her legs felt weak with shock. He gave her the same sort of look she was giving him, as if he'd just seen a ghost. Mary? She tried to form words, but nothing would come out. Instead, she stared at him in shock. It couldn't be. He was dead. My mother said you died. Was that the only way you could think to get away from me? His voice was filled with anger. She sputtered for a moment in the face of his emotions. All she could feel was relief that he was really alive. How could he be mad? Papa said you were killed. She wanted to run to him, but the look on his face told her that wasn't an option. Sure. William shook his head, turning away from her. I think you can find your way back east. All the pent-up tears and all the emotions she'd felt for him for the past 5 years came crashing down. Right there on the train platform, she felt the tears start to pour down her cheeks. William, wait. He rubbed the back of his neck with his hand, recognizing that tone in her voice. She was crying, as if she had nothing to do with deceiving him. But how could he believe that? His mother loved him. She wouldn't lie. He turned back around, not looking at her face, and instead staring at a point a few inches above her head. He couldn't watch her cry over him. Not again. What do you need? Mary dragged her hands over her cheeks, not bothering with her handkerchief. She recognized this moment as pivotal. He would either accept her or he wouldn't, based on whatever she said right then. She stepped closer to him, her hand going out to touch him, but she couldn't. Not yet. Please give me a chance. Send a letter to Mrs. Johnson, the old housekeeper who worked for my father. She'll tell you what I was told. Don't throw our love away. 5 years have already been wasted. Love? Didn't you read my letter? I have no love left to give. His voice was hard, the same way it had been when he'd come to her rescue and hit Bob. He'd never used that tone with her before. I didn't think I did either. When I thought you were dead. She shook her head. Please, William. Everyone in town will tell you that I left when I found out you died. That my heart was broken. He shook his head, unable to believe her. What exactly do you want from me, Mary? She took a deep breath, swallowing every ounce of pride she'd ever possessed. I want you to fulfill your promise. You asked me to marry you when I was 16. You invited me to come here and marry you just a few weeks ago. Do what you said you'd do. He stared at her, curious about what had changed her so much. She'd never been prideful, but 5 years ago she wouldn't have even considered begging a man to marry her. You want me to marry you, knowing that the only emotions I have for you are disgust? You'd marry a man who didn't even want to look at you. She closed her eyes, trying to calm her racing heart. If that man was you, I would. I've loved you since I was 14 years old, and I'll love you until the day I die. If it means I can spend every day close to you, I'll marry you. At her words, all of the old feelings came rushing through him. No, I can't love her again. She deliberately deceived me. He sighed. You are a better actress than I realized. She took the steps that would allow her to touch him, placing her hand flat on his chest, a familiar gesture for both of them. Please, William. I've been called Bill since I came to South Dakota. I can try to adjust. She didn't care what she called him. It was him she cared about. What was it Shakespeare had said? A rose by any other name would smell as sweet. If we marry, we do it my way. Anything. She knew she shouldn't agree so readily, but she had to. She couldn't walk away and leave the only man she'd ever love. Not when he'd been lost to her for 5 years. No one knows about our history. Everyone just thinks you're the mail-order bride I sent for. He lowered his voice to barely a whisper. You will be a good wife to me. You'll cook, clean, and do all of the womanly chores around the farm. I will send a letter back home, and I will find out the truth. If I find out you're lying to me, or that you've ever lied to me, I'll be sending you right back to Massachusetts. She nodded. Of course. He tilted his head to one side. He desperately wanted to believe her, but how could he? His own mother claimed to have been at her funeral. Let's go see Pastor Robertson then. He looked down at the carpet bag in her hand, and he wanted with everything inside him to tell her to carry it herself, but he couldn't. Until it was confirmed that she was lying to him, he couldn't treat her badly. He couldn't treat her badly if she was lying to him. It wasn't in him. He took the bag from her and started walking toward his wagon. Wait. There's another trunk. The trunk that held all the letters she'd written to him. That held her mother's wedding dress, the one she planned to wear that day. He threw her carpet bag into the back of the wagon and walked over to a railroad official. Mary waited for him to come back. She'd learned to get into wagons on her own during their time apart, but she wanted him to want to help her. He always had when they'd gone for drives together back in Massachusetts. He had the official help him get the trunk into the back of his wagon, and then he walked over to offer Mary a hand up. It was the first time he'd touched her since her arrival, and he felt the old familiar electricity shoot up his arm. He didn't want to feel anything for her, but how could he help it? He'd loved her since he was a boy, and despite what he'd said to her, he still did. He couldn't make himself stop. As they drove toward Butterfly Meadows, all he could think of was the years that had been wasted. He'd mourned for the girl he'd loved every day for the past 5 years. He'd wake up in the middle of the night, aching for her. His answer had always been the same. He'd work. If it was a warm month, he'd go do some weeding on one of his fields. During the cold months, he'd do something to improve his barn or his home. As a result, his house was one any woman would be proud to call her own. He found himself excited to show her the place. He said nothing for the first few minutes of the drive, and Mary couldn't stand the silence any longer. "About a week after I got your letter that you'd settled here in South Dakota, your mother came to my house. She and Papa went into the parlor and shut the door for more than an hour. When they came out, your mother left and Papa told me you had been trampled by your horse and died." She looked down at her hands, which were folding and unfolding pleats into her skirt for want of something to do. "I left that night. I believed him that you died, but I blamed him for it, because he was the one who sent you away." He swallowed hard, hating to think of her on her own so young. "Where did you go?" "I took the train to the next town. I didn't have much money, but I could make it that far. I met a kind woman at the train station, and she offered me the job of cook at her home. Her name was Elizabeth Miller. It's Elizabeth Tandy now." "So you were really a cook?" "I can't imagine you being anyone's servant." Mary made a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. "You'd be surprised. Elizabeth was, well, she saved me. I don't know what I would have done if she hadn't found me in that train station. After a week, she told me she needed me to do more than the cooking. Really, I was cooking for her and a couple of other servants, so the job wasn't all that taxing. She added in helping her with the mail-order bride business, and that kept me busy." She shook her head. "I'm not sure that I would have been able to keep going without her help." "Keep going?" "I wasn't sure I wanted to live in a world where you no longer existed." She didn't look at him as she said the words, but they spoke clearly to the very dark place she'd been in after his death. "You don't mean that. I don't think you have any idea what your love meant to me. What it still means to me." "I just kept working harder," he said softly. "When I got the letter from Ma saying that you were dead, I broke some horses for a neighbor. They'd been wild, and I thought they'd kill me. I didn't care. I slept only a couple of hours a night, because every time I closed my eyes, I'd see you lying in a coffin." He took a shuddering breath. "Imagine my astonishment to find out you were still alive." She sniffled, wiping away a tear. "I'm not sure why our parents did this, but it's obviously something they thought up together. I'm sorry you went through that. I do understand the pain you must have been in." He glanced over at her. "Are you upset because you know my pain? Or because you were found out?" She sighed. "I can't convince you. Send a letter home. There are any number of people who will tell you the truth." "Don't think I won't." He wanted to trust her with everything inside him, but how could he ever forgive his mother if he believed Mary? "Tell me about your farm." She wasn't going to stay on that topic. They'd already beaten it into the ground in her opinion. He shrugged. "It's a full quarter section of land. I plant wheat and corn. I have a few cows that I use for milk, but I'm mainly the same kind of farmer my pa was, a dirt farmer." "Was?" "I hadn't heard your pa passed." "I'm sorry." She knew he'd been very close to his father. My kid brother, Samuel, took over the farm. Ma still lives there. Sam's married. Do you remember Dorothy Redden? I do. Don't tell me Sam married Dottie. She laughed softly. I remember when she was mooning about you. She'd pass me notes in class telling me that someday she'd be Mrs. Jones. She meant you, though, not Sam. Bill grinned. He remembered the same crush. She was a pain in my behind at times. Mary shook her head. You know you shouldn't mention your behind in polite company. He couldn't believe how easy it was to fall into their playful banter they'd had for years. And you think it's all right for you to mention my behind? William Jones, you know better. Haven't you got anything better to do than tease me? He stopped the wagon and set the brake, looking over at her. I guess I'd forgotten just how much fun teasing you is. He jumped down and walked around holding a hand up to help her down. Pastor Robertson is expecting us. With her hand in his, she looked up at him, amazed at how familiar he looked, even under his shaggy beard. I've missed you. The words were so simple and heartfelt, he almost took her in his arms right there, but he couldn't. He couldn't let her get under his skin again until he was certain what had happened 5 years before. He took a quick step back. Let's go get married. She nodded, sad that he'd stepped away. For a moment there, she'd been certain he'd forgive her for everything and kiss her, but he hadn't. Soon, he'd realized there was nothing to forgive, but it would all be fine. She wouldn't hold it against him. She couldn't. She loved him more with every moment she spent with him. She'd fallen in love with a boy, but there was a man beside her, a man she would spend all her tomorrows with. Even though he was angry with her, she closed her eyes and said a silent prayer. Thank you, God. Thank you for bringing my William and I back together. Thank you for not letting him die. Thank you for my future. Tucking her hand through his arm, she walked with him to the door of the pastor's house and waited as he knocked on the door. Chapter 5. Mrs. Robertson opened the door and invited them inside. Bill, this must be Marilyn, the bride you sent away for. It's so nice to meet you. Mary smiled. Please call me Mary. Mary, would you care to take a bath before the ceremony? If I'd been on a train for days on end like you have, I'd want to clean up. Please. That would be wonderful, if you don't mind. Of course not, dear. Mrs. Robertson smiled at William. You'll wait for her, won't you, Bill? William frowned. As long as she doesn't keep me waiting too long. Mary followed the older woman into a bedroom where there was already a tub of water waiting. I forgot my wedding dress. It's in my trunk. I'll be right back. Mary dashed out of the room and out the front door, finding William close behind her. You're not going to embarrass me by running off on our wedding day, are you? She shook her head. I wouldn't think of it. I've wanted to marry you since I was 14 years old. She jumped up onto the back of the wagon, demonstrating an agility that would have embarrassed her in her youth. She had different notions of what it took to be a woman now than she had then. I forgot my wedding dress. I want to wear the dress my mama wore. He frowned. You brought it to wear to marry a stranger? Not at all. I wanted it for my daughter. But now that I know I'm marrying you, I need it today. I would have had it in my carpet bag otherwise, where it was easier to get to. You have an answer for everything, don't you? She shrugged. If you say so. I'm just trying to do what's right. She found the dress, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, and hugged it to her as she jumped down from the back of the wagon. If you'll excuse me, I would rather not smell like I haven't bathed in a month when we marry. William watched her run back toward the house, her dress clutched close to her chest. He smiled as he remembered the girl who had kicked him to keep him from kissing her so long ago. His little mail-order bride was bringing back so many memories. It hurt. 30 minutes later, Mary was ready. Her hair was still a little damp, but she'd brushed it as dry as she could, winding it into a tight knot atop her head. Her pink dress was fitted in the waist, and the skirt was fuller than was in fashion, but Mary didn't care. Her mama had worn it for her wedding to the man she loved, and now Mary would wear it to marry William. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She was marrying her William. After thinking he was dead for 5 years, the man she loved was in the very next room, waiting with the preacher. A knock on the door revealed Mrs. Robertson. "Are you ready, dear?" Mary nodded. "I am." Instead of opening the door wider for Mary to leave, Mrs. Robertson stepped into the room with her and shut the door. "I just wanted to tell you, if Bill seems overly gruff, it's because he lost the girl he loved a few years back, right after he came here. I think he'll soften as time goes by, but you may not see the man he was for a while. I hope you can show him some kindness and make it easier on him." It was all Mary could do not to spill her guts to the older woman, telling her everything. She'd given William her word, though, and she wouldn't go back on it. "I'll be careful with him. He's a good man." Mrs. Robertson nodded emphatically. "He is. I'm so glad you can see it. It shines from his eyes, doesn't it?" Mary followed the preacher's wife into the parlor where William was waiting for her. His eyes roamed her from head to toe, and he nodded subtly. "Are you ready?" "I am." Mary walked to William's side, and he looked down at her. "Are you?" A slight smile touched his lips. She'd always had a way of catching him off guard, making him see humor in situations where he'd not see any without her. He sighed. How could a man not love a woman as wonderful as his Mary? If only she hadn't had others lie to him about her. As he looked at her, he couldn't see it happening, but there was really no other excuse that he could imagine. He took her hand in his when Pastor Robertson told him to, and they proceeded through the ceremony. When it was over, and they were pronounced man and wife, he turned to her, holding her waist with his big hands and pulling her to him. His lips pressed to hers, and she moved her hand up to his shoulder. Her first kiss as his wife. She'd never forget it. Mrs. Robertson hurried away and brought back her bag from the back of the house, and William led Mary back to the wagon. He felt panic envelop him as he helped her into the wagon. How could he have married her, putting himself under her power once again? He'd have to be careful, never letting his feelings show. She would be able to control him completely otherwise. Mary looked out over the small town, spotting a man and a woman walking along holding hands, with a little girl running around them carrying, was that a baseball bat? Girls in the West must be very different than what she was used to. Is that little girl carrying a baseball bat? William looked over at the small family walking along. She's new in town. I haven't met her yet. She's the daughter of the woman who came to marry the town doctor. Dr. Hardy. Dr. Hardy had mentioned sending for a wife, and that's how he'd heard about Elizabeth Tandy as a matchmaker. I'll have to find my way over to meet her mother soon. It'll be nice to not be the only new woman in town. We're a good 5 miles out in the country. You're welcome to come into town and meet her if you want, but it's a long way to go to make a friend. He'd rather she wasn't out wandering around the countryside until he heard back from Massachusetts. He needed to know she was true to him before he allowed her that kind of freedom. He didn't want his reputation tarnished by her actions. Mary looked at him. For some people, no distance is too far. His eyes met hers, and he flushed a bit. He needed her to stop saying things like that. It made it so much harder to keep her at arm's length. As he drove toward his farm, he wondered how she would like it. It was isolated, the nearest neighbor more than a mile away, and it wasn't nearly as luxurious as she'd grown up with. She'd only once been to his family's farm back in Massachusetts, and he'd never forget the look of surprise on her face when she'd seen it. It was obviously not what she was used to, but she hadn't said a word, even complimenting his mother on her lovely home. Their financial disparity had never bothered him when they were younger, but he suddenly worried that the house wouldn't be up to her standards. He sighed. Even if it wasn't, she would make do. It's what she did. If she didn't like it, she could go back home to Massachusetts. Even as he thought the words, he knew they weren't true. He couldn't let her go. She was his. Now that he had her, she'd do well if he ever let her out of his sight. But how could he do that without her realizing how much he loved her? He shook his head. He'd figure it out if it killed him. "This is a beautiful area," she said softly, trying to get him to open up. Their wedding may not have been what she'd always dreamed it would be, but it was still her wedding day, and she was going to be happy. "I want to stop and pick all the flowers for our supper table." He smiled, pulling the wagon to the side of the road, finding it impossible not to indulge her. He could still see her as a 7-year-old picking flowers for her family's table, while her mother watched out the window for her to come home. "Be my guest." She looked at him for a moment, her eyes lighting up with excitement. She hadn't thought he'd agree to her whim. "I'll be right back." She'd spent the past 5 years living in Beckham, which wasn't a big town, but it was much larger than the one she'd grown up in. It would be nice for her to be able to pick flowers when she wanted. As she wandered choosing the right mix of flowers, her mother's words rang in her ears. "Make sure you don't pick them all. Leave some for others." When she got back to the wagon, she climbed in on her own, cradling the flowers in her arms. "I feel like I'll have a little piece of my mama in our home as long as I have flowers on my table." "You still miss her, don't you?" She nodded. "I miss the years I didn't have with her more than anything. Mrs. Johnson was a good surrogate mother, teaching me to cook, clean, sew, and all the other good skills a wife should have. But it was never the same. When I sewed my first stitches, it was sitting on my mother's lap, her hands guiding me. I'll never forget my precious moments with her. I felt that way about my special moments with a girl I knew back home. The first time I tried to put a toad down the back of her dress. The time I tried to kiss her and she kicked me. When I stood up in class and said the flowers weren't from that other boy, what was his name? Albert." She laughed softly. "Albert moved to New York City to become a banker. He said that there was nothing in New England for a man of his refined tastes." William rolled his eyes. "I can hear him say it too. He was well, I won't use those words in the presence of a lady. Even if she is my wife." He parked the wagon in the middle of a farmyard, and she turned her head every which way, straining to see as much as she could. He got down and helped her to the ground. "I'll show you around before I unhitch the team." He climbed the 3 steps up to the front porch. Everything he'd done building the house had been done with her in mind. The porch traveled the entire length of the house with a porch swing with enough room for 2. He opened the front door and scooped her off her feet, carrying her inside. She squealed as her feet left the ground. She hadn't expected that. It seemed terribly romantic for the man who had met her at the train station, but it didn't seem nearly romantic enough for the William who had left her alone. Was the real man somewhere in between? The first room was the kitchen. There was a sink with running water, and over the sink was a window. "I'll be able to look out while I'm washing up the dishes." He shook his head. Was anyone really as excited about chores as she sounded? He led her into the dining room. There was a large oak table he'd made himself, carefully sanding the wood for each spindle of the legs. The chairs matched perfectly, because he'd made those as well. The first year after her death, he'd slept less than 4 hours per night, always getting up and doing some kind of work to keep his mind off her. He couldn't stop seeing her lying in a coffin, her face pale from the illness that he'd been told caused her death. He led her into the parlor, the furniture there store-bought and stark. The sofa needed a blanket thrown over the back, either a quilt or one of those things women made with yarn. He could see so much potential when he looked at it all through her eyes. She walked to the rocking chair, softly running her hand over the back. "It's like the one my mama sat and watched for me in. I remember how much that chair meant to you, so when I made a rocker, I tried to make it like that. I didn't expect you to ever see it, of course, but it was my way of remembering the girl I'd loved." When he said the word loved, her heart sank. He really had no more love for her? He said he didn't, but she'd been holding out hope until that moment. "It's lovely. It just needs a crocheted afghan over the back of it. And a couple of quilted pillows on the sofa, with a quilt thrown over the back." She kept her back to him, so he wouldn't see the tears prick her eyes. "Sounds nice." He loved the idea of her putting her touches on their home. He'd built it for her, though he'd never thought she'd live in it. It was strange, the way life brought one full circle at times. "Come on. I want to show you the bathroom and the bedrooms. There's one bedroom downstairs, and 3 upstairs." He led her down a short hallway, to a bedroom. The bed was big, and as she looked at it, she blushed. She'd be sharing a bed with him that night. He wasn't the stranger she'd expected, but the situation was still awkward. "It's a lovely room. Would you mind if I made a new quilt for the bed?" The blankets on it were ragged and old, probably ones he'd brought west with him. She couldn't wait to start sewing and put her own touches on this little house. "I'd like that." He cleared his throat, obviously uncomfortable. "You know what? You can show yourself the rest of the house. Feel free to explore. I need to get my chores done. It would be nice if supper was ready in about an hour." Mary frowned after William as he but ran from the room. She shrugged, going into the kitchen and pulling her apron from her carpet bag that he'd kindly left there for her. She found the cellar door, and lifted the latch, climbing down into the basement to see what she could make. Gathering a few jars, she went back up, noticing the icebox for the first time. She'd had one back in Beckham, of course, but they were new enough that she hadn't expected to see one here in South Dakota. She'd make a thick, hearty stew. Soon it would be too warm for hot foods, and she wanted to show off her cooking skills. She wanted so badly for him to be proud of taking her for a wife. She made a mental note of all the things she needed to buy at the mercantile in town the first chance she got. Soon this house would be as much hers as it was his. She'd see to it.